Andy, one of the software engineering team leads in iPlayer.
And I'm Emily Atkins. I'm a senior UX designer in iPlayer.
Great, so we just want to get an idea of who's in the room, so we're going to do a bit of hands up. Hands up if you're a developer. Whoa.
Cool, quite a lot of you.
80%. Designer. Nice.
Awesome.
Tester, QA, a few.
Cool.
Editorial, person covering. Marketing. Nice. What else have I forgotten? Anyone else? Any other roles? Product owners, BAs, that kind of thing? A few more. Cool. Okay. So mostly developers. Cool. Okay, so we're going to keep the hands up thing going. Hands up if you consider. Oh, where's that gone? Oh, it's back.
There we go. We're back.
Hands up if you consider yourself or someone in your family to have a long-term or permanent disability. So this could be hearing impaired, vision impaired, restricted mobility. So like about 10 people. Okay. So according to Department for Work and Pensions, about 1 in 5 people in the UK have a long-term illness, impairment or disability. So quite a few.
So sticking with the hands up, keep your hand up if you've ever had a temporary disability at all. So like myself the other year when I attempted to ice skate and broke my arm. Or it could be something like a broken leg or, a eye infection or hearing infection. The point is, at some point, we can all have a temporary disability. And side note, I'm not a natural ice skater.
Evidently. And now hands up if you've ever had a situational disability. So, not many hands, come on guys. Maybe you've struggled to see your phone in the sunlight, or you've struggled to use your phone whilst you're carrying a baby or some shopping. Yeah? Basically, everyone has some accessibility needs at some point in their life. Now, cast your mind back to 1997, when Tim Berners-Lee said this: "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." And this is still relevant today, if not more so, as we have bigger and more interactive and rich websites.
However, we're seeing at least 40% of local council sites failed basic accessibility tests. And when you consider that these are the places where people come to, pay bills, pay council tax, general public services, that's really not a good position to be in. And I think more worryingly, we've got 70% of UK websites that are inaccessible. And that's meaning that they're exposing their business to, significant reputational damage, but also quite significant legal risk as well, particularly in America where there's much stronger laws around accessibility guidelines.
Yep, new regulations came into force for public sector bodies in 2018 that say you now must make your website or mobile app accessible by making it perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust.
Cool, so we've talked a little bit about sort of various types of accessibility. We're going to talk a bit more about designing for accessibility, when to think about it in the project sort of life cycle. Andy's going to talk through some of the development processes, and then we're going to talk a bit about automated and manual testing. And then we're going to talk a bit about the team culture, because that's sort of what really underpins the way we work at the BBC. And if we've got time, we'll do some Q&A as well. So designing for accessibility. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a senior UX designer in iPlayer. So really the kind of design process starts with our designers, and we have a copy of these posters that were produced by the Home Office up on the wall in iPlayer. And these are a really good reference point for sort of general kind of accessibility pointers. But also it's a great reminder that accessible design can be beautiful too. We've got a couple of these. I think I've got 6 on this particular presentation. So we'll skip through to the next one. I think there's about 7 or 8 in total, but they're really nicely designed. And like I said, it's a fantastic reference point for just being able to kind of dip in and out and see those really key points for designing for accessibility. So I also wanted to kind of mention and call out a couple of things that we do in terms of accessibility and sort of what we do to kind of get the sort of basic needs kind of covered. So a big part of that is logical reading order. So we're kind of looking at sort of what makes the kind of logical flow for the user, and also how screen readers might navigate through that as well. We're also kind of looking at heading tags. I'm not going to go too much into that because I know Andy's going to talk a bit more about that in the development process. But even in the design process, we're thinking about the kind of meaningful link text and trying to make that more relevant and contextual other than just something like click here. Further to that, also color contrast is something that we're looking at. Throughout the design process, we're often using kind of online color contrast checkers to be able to kind of check our sort of foreground and text color just to make sure that we're actually keeping those needs at the forefront of our minds. Alt text as well for images. Again, that's something Andy's going to touch a bit more on in a bit. And fonts as well. One thing we really try and do is keep a very consistent and clear typeface throughout. We're always trying to make sure that we don't kind of bring in too many kind of fancy, crazy display fonts and that the kind of meaning of the text isn't conveyed through the font. And a big part of our design process is underpinned by our global experience language, or GEL, as we call it in BBC. These are public, so you can go online and have a quick look at those. I think it's bbc.co.uk/GEL. And these have our design patterns on. They also have our how-to guides, which cover kind of various accessibility needs, including not just kind of general accessibility, but also other points in the kind of sort of whole end-to-end process, such as things like accessible email newsletters as well. Now, a couple of things we've been doing in iPlayer to kind of really sort of help our accessible design. One of those things is the development and release of the new BBC font. So in 2018, we released BBC Wreath, and prior to that, we'd been using our previous fonts, such as Helvetica, and they weren't designed with screen in mind, because obviously they're much older. And obviously they didn't perform as well on kind of smaller spaces and that kind of smaller real estate, which is kind of mobile and screens. So as well as having this opportunity to kind of custom make a font and rebrand, we also looked at it as an opportunity to solve these accessibility issues by having a digitally optimized typeface. Another thing we've been looking at in iPlayer is also kind of making the layout a bit more kind of unified and a bit more consistent. So you can see we've kind of, on the left there, we've kind of gone from a sort of slightly more kind of up and down layout to a kind of more kind of regimented, kind of easier to kind of navigate, and also much easier for kind of screen readers to navigate as well. Cool. So that's a kind of very kind of quick fire design process in accessibility in iPlayer. But let's talk a little bit about when we need to think about that. So we don't really want it to get to the point where people complained because things weren't accessible. So when should we be thinking about this in the project lifecycle? So I guess we could think about it when people, that leave it to the testers to bring this up and kind of see, pick things up in testing. I guess, developers, they know a bit about accessibility. They might, maybe it's down to them to actually implement all these accessibility criteria. Maybe it's people like myself who are designing for accessibility. Maybe they should be the ones who are responsible for actually providing accessible designs in the first place. Or maybe it's, right at the beginning of the requirement process when we're gathering requirements and the product owners are kind of looking for requirements. Maybe it's on them to kind of take that on. Well, unsurprisingly, it's for everybody to take a responsibility in the whole process. And even more so, not just after you've released the product, but completely going, iterating and maintaining that product as well.
Cool. Okay, so let's have a look at the development process now. So what we do in iPlayer Web is we build documented components so that our developers can write simple code to create accessible web pages. So essentially, we use React, and we create React components. So here's some of the examples. This is the hero header, which is our page header component, which you can find on the iPlayer site. Some of the things we do in the hero header is we set the title to be an H1. So you've always got your main top-level heading on the page. So as long as our devs are using the hero header, they get the H1 for free. We've also got the responsive image component. So Emily mentioned earlier the alt tag, the alt attribute. So as Emily said, this is the alternative text for the image. So if the image can't be loaded, or if you're using a screen reader, for example, or some other kind of assistive technology, the alternative text will be read out. Normally, if you miss an alt attribute on an image, what the browser will do is get it to read out the file name, So if you've got a really bad file name or just an ID or something, that's not going to be helpful for the users. However, if you put an empty alt text rather than skipping it completely, the screen reader will assume the image is decorative and just skip past the image. So what we have in our responsive image component is defaulting the alt attribute to an empty string, so that if you don't put one in, we assume the image is just decorative and the screen reader will skip past it. We've also got a drop-down component. Unlabeled drop-downs or selects are difficult to understand without context. So, for example, if you just had this, you might get just featured, menu item, main, one item. So you've got no idea what this featured thing is. So what we've done in our drop-down component is we have a label property, which adds a label element to the select. So then when this is passed in by the developers, it will be read out as a select box, and it will make much more sense. So in this example, it would say featured, change sort, collapsed, pop-up button. So in this case, we know the current item is featured, and if you change it, you change the sort, and the select is currently collapsed. We've also got a section component, which actually uses the HTML5 section HTML element. We have an array label property on this, which adds a label to the section, which makes each section a landmark or a region on the page. So if you're navigating by region, it's much easier to navigate. So for example, if you get to this area of the page, it would say region if you like Doctor Who. So if you didn't like Doctor Who, you can skip to the next region. So that's how we develop it. Let's move on to automated testing. And as Jamie Knight, who Emily mentioned earlier, one of our senior accessibility specialists, as he likes to say from time to time, as designers, and developers, we disable people when we don't get it right. So we need to make sure we're getting it right so that we're not disabling our users. So with automated testing tools, we can more easily spot when we have made some mistakes, when we haven't quite got it right. So let's have a look at some automated testing tools. So Google Lighthouse. So Lighthouse is an automated tool for checking the quality of your web pages. It can do many things, not just accessibility, but the accessibility part is powered by Axe Core, and that's got a number of various rules in it. And you can run it against any web page on the internet, just using the developer tools built into the Chrome browser. As I said, it's got various audits, including performance, accessibility, progressive web apps, and a few more. So what did Lighthouse bring up for us? So picked up, as Emily mentioned, background and foreground colors should be having sufficient contrast ratio, and actually spotted that this white 1 on the pink background isn't quite sufficient contrast ratio. Picked that up and told us that low contrast text is difficult or impossible for many users to read. So we tweaked those colors so it was good contrast. It also spotted these arrow buttons on our carousels. Buttons must have an accessible name. When they don't, screen readers will just announce it as button, making it unusable for users who rely on screen readers. So you can imagine tabbing through this page and you get to this arrow and it just says button. It's not very useful. So we added a label to that. It also spotted these view all links as well. As you can see, they all say view all. But when you're looking at the page visually, you'll get the headings of the page cropped out in the screenshot. But if you're just tabbing with a screen reader, for example, they'll all just say view all. So Lighthouse noticed this as well. Link text that is discernible, unique, and focusable improves the navigation experience for screen reader users. So we added in either a label or some hidden text. So when you get to those view all links, it will read out view all sports or view all Doctor Who or whatever it is. So it's really easy to run Google Lighthouse. You just open your Chrome Developer Tools, go to the Audits tab, click Perform an Audit, and then choose the accessibility option, and obviously the other options if you want to do that as well, and then click Run Audit. It only takes about 20 seconds to run, and it will output your score. As you can see, this is the iPlayer homepage, scoring 100 out of 100. So, other automated tools, we've got BBC Alley. What is BBC Alley? So this is the BBC's own accessibility standards checker. It's an internally developed tool, and it checks whether your web pages meet the BBC's accessibility standards. So it is open source, and anyone can use it and run it. So you just need npm on your machine. So install that if you don't have it, and then npm install bbc-a11y --global if you want it globally installed. And it's as simple as running BBC Ali and then the URL of the page you want to check. It will then output something like this. So this was the BBC homepage a few months ago. So it tells you things like text is styled with pixels, so it can't be resized. Headings went in ascending order. And at the bottom, it gives you links off to the BBC's guidelines, so you can find out more about the problems that it's found. So we liked Google Lighthouse, and we liked BBC Ali. So what we did was create a wrapper around both, Ali Test Web. So this wraps around, as I say, BBC Ali and Google Lighthouse, and allows you to put all your configuration for Lighthouse and BBC Ali in one place. Another BBC open source repo on GitHub. Again, use this node, so you'll need npm. You can install the package globally, and then from your command line, you just let it know the config, and then Ali Test Web, and then whether you want Lighthouse or BBC Ali, and then what mode you want to run in. So it's got a few modes, JUnit, or just pretty output, that kind of thing. You can also bake it into your node applications, so then it's even easier for your devs to run it. Install it as a dev dependency in your app, and then just add a line to your package JSON, like test Ali, for example, and then all your devs can just run npm run test Ali, and behind the scenes it's running your relevant config for your app. But, as Dijkstra once said, testing only shows the presence, not the absence of bugs. So what do we need to do? We need to do some manual testing as well. So testers in our team will do manual testing as well as the developers. BBC Ali has a helpful manual testing feature. Same command as before, but with -- manual in the end. And what it will do, it will pop up the page that you're testing, and at the bottom of the screen, it will ask you some questions. So you can write your comments for each question and say yes or no, and then at the end, it will give you a report which you can then hand off to your developer or BA or whatever. So some of the questions it asks include, is information conveyed with color also identifiable from context or markup? So for example, this was the BBC Sports page at a previous Olympics. Can anyone spot the problem with colour on this page? Louder?
Silver medal.
Gold medal, silver medal, absolutely. So if you can't see the colours, you have no idea which is gold, silver and bronze. So they spotted this and added in G, S and B on the medals. Some other questions it asks, do the colour combinations pass colour contrast checks? We mentioned that before. Do all text links have a mouse over state change? So if you're mousing around the screen, can you tell what link you're hovering on? Are all focusable elements, are they all clearly identifiable visually when they have a focus? If you're tabbing through the page, can you tell what you're focused on at the moment? Does the page work without JavaScript or CSS? As Becky mentioned earlier, lots of people have JavaScript turned off or it just hasn't loaded yet. Is the content visible and usable if the page is zoomed in or the text is resized 200%? Lots of people will make the page bigger or the text bigger. And we also do screen reader testing as well. I think someone asked earlier what Becky does. In iPlayer Web, we do NVDA on Windows and VoiceOver on Mac. And this will cover sort of the vast majority of screen reader testing.
Cool, so we've talked a lot about the developing process, the design process, and also kind of when to think about accessibility in your sort of project life cycle. All of that is kind of underpinned really by the kind of team culture that's adopted. Now we're kind of lucky here at the BBC because we've obviously got really great opportunities here to learn about this and also kind of adopt this a bit more within our culture and kind of improve on our knowledge and skills. And a lot of that is done through kind of knowledge sharing within the team. So we're really lucky that when you first start here, we've got that kind of introduction to accessibility. We have screen reader training offhand. You've also got that kind of accessibility basics for web developers, which designers and product and project and anyone who's interested really can book onto that course as well. And knowledge sharing is really big throughout kind of iPlayer and Sounds. In particular, recently we started guilds, which have kind of fortnightly catch-ups to kind of swarm and kind of crowd around a particular problem or ongoing issue and kind of look at tackling specific accessibility issues around there, and also kind of look at how we can how we can kind of share and continue that ongoing knowledge. And I guess kind of the big thing within iPlayer and Sounds and across the BBC as a whole is the champion scheme. Now, I know I showed you kind of a screenshot of the accessibility team. You saw their lovely faces earlier on. Those guys kind of set up and kind of support the champion scheme, which is basically where volunteers such as myself and Andy throughout not only design, but also engineering, product, test, can kind of volunteer to be an accessibility champion and therefore kind of go and kind of get extra training and support from the accessibility team. The idea is that that knowledge is then kind of taken back into the various product teams, and we've kind of got this kind of radiation out of kind of different knowledge sets within each product. We're supported by extra training and also kind of champion events such as external speakers. We've had people from Microsoft and Barclays kind of come in and talk about what they're doing in accessibility as well.
Cool. So, remember that quote from Tim Berners-Lee? As you can tell in iPlayer Web, we agree with Tim. And through doing these three things, building accessibility in from the start, making sure we're testing everything, and driving a really good team culture around accessibility, we're doing our bit to make sure that iPlayer is accessible as it can be. Thank you very much.